All right, my audible and can everyone see me?
Yep, we can.
All right, just give me 1 sec to set up papers, so that's all right. Okay, I take POIs in the chat, so just chuck them in there. The single unit with one of the highest rates of war crimes of any nationality in Afghanistan was an Australian one, led by a man named Ben Robert Smith. The reason that unit was so terrible was because they had kill counts, they had certain levels of leaderboards for their murders, and they had practical jokes that they would play wherein they would leverage the form of toxic culture that exists in the army and use it on civilians in a way that was enormously detrimental, in a way that destroyed a bunch of people's lives, in a way that meant that culture was entrenched in that army unit for almost a decade. We are going to prove a few things. Firstly, we're going to explain why these particular sets of circumstances are the worst form of ways these things can manifest. Secondly, we're going to explain why you get worse soldiers and why you pass a very particularly bad narrative in terms of your marketing and market the army in a really pernicious way. And finally, we're going to explain why this is likely to lead to worse oppressor classes in terms of the people getting promoted. Firstly, in terms of why this is a particularly bad place for this to happen. So the first thing to understand here is that army training grounds are immensely toxic environments for the specific reason that they want to see if they can break you. They want to see whether or not you will fail under the pressure, because they don't want to involve the sunk cost of sending someone to Afghanistan just for them not to be able to fight. That's why drill instructors are not, vicious drill instructors are not a thing of the past. They're a thing of the present day. And when that toxic culture exists, it will exist in either world, but in their world, they have to deal with the fact there are leaderboards, and that will break you. They have to deal with the fact that they are passed on in an incredibly pernicious way. Next, where do we think this is going to take place, like geographically? I think it's kind of intuitive. It's probably going to take more so in the Western world, for two reasons. Firstly, it's just that the ones that have particularly the resources to focus on training. That's where the United States has spent almost like the vast majority of its money, excluding things like just buying literal shells for Ukraine. Secondly, it's where these ideas are most prominent already, i.e., as we explained earlier, the Western world is where things like toxic cultures of kill counts can sometimes exist in some parts, and this is a policy that expands those in really bad ways. The next thing I want to explain is just that obviously this is not going to be a system of built-in accountability, for the reason that the United States Army is a marketing tool in a lot of ways. It does not want to explain exactly how bad it can be and to have those sorts of things leak. Very last thing in terms of framings, I think it's unlikely this is going to be simulations of like how to fly a plane, in the sense that those are things that already happen, and in the sense those are things that are very real practical training and not in fact a game, which is why it doesn't happen, why that is something that can occur in both worlds. So first argument then, why you get far worse soldiers. Firstly, because you provide enormous overemphasis on individual performance in a way that is incredibly toxic. Firstly, there is less communication because you promote and teach less communication because you want to take advantage of a certain thing. You want to climatize yourself onto the leaderboards, noting that oftentimes there are very few selections in terms of army placements to get through, noting that often it is likely that the sort forms of records that exist in training are the ones that are used for promotion later, are the ones that get you to opt into certain types of missions or to put you on certain types of things. The second thing to say is that in this sense, a message is that these people are individual, and that breaks protocol in a very bad way. This is where most soldiers go rogue, which is specifically the instance where most war crimes are committed, when soldiers are trying to chase things by themselves or in a particularly harmful way. And I think it is likely that things like drill instructors want to test that for the reason that they want to test each person individually rather than testing the combat resolve of an entire unit, because that unit is likely to be split up over a large number of places. Next, this enormously worsens the form of marketing that the United States government has in a way that gets a bunch of innocent people into fighting wars and battles in a way that is incredibly coercive. Why is that true? Firstly, because you make this form of marketing incredibly persuasive to a large amount of people with a bunch of experience in terms of playing video games, but that cultivated set of hours of experience of sitting on your couch is likely to be incredibly, is likely to mean that people perceive fighting in war in a certain way. And when the United States Army is able to leverage that form of rhetoric, is able to say, well, this is what law is like, and is able to use its extensive form of TikTok psyop, which is already trying to use, is likely that I think, like, just reasonably, this does mean that a few more people go into the military, if not like a bunch of people. I think it is reasonably likely that it is more people, or at the very least, it changes a bunch of people's perceptions, at least in a small way, in such a way as they perceive the army in a better light or more favorably, such that they are less prone to towards being prompted towards criticism of it. Next, I'm going to prove why this is just more likely to mean that you kill lots of civilians in a way that is incredibly unnecessary, in a way that is incredibly harmful. Before I do, I'm happy to take one information from closing. Or,
I think I'm missing the link. You say that there is more focus on individual performance. Why does that focus on individual performance translate to more human rights abuses on the battlefield?
Okay, there are a number of reasons why that's true. I think I've established them first. First of all, because it creates and teaches to these people a form of competitiveness, that you don't have to work with your soldiers. You're trying to outcompete them in a very real way. You're trying to obtain things in a literal leaderboard in order to put yourself on top. And as we explained, this is likely to be in the form of a toxic drill instructor or a toxic community that is likely to punish the person who is the weakest, noting that this is often a form of things that armies already engage in. They punish the person who is on the bottom, and that is likely to motivate people in order to do things they would not otherwise do. It programs in a section of like mental instability or mental toxicness in a way that will translate to where these people go in the future, because you're cultivating a whole new set of recruits in a way that is incredibly, incredibly bad. So next point, why this means that you're just likely to get you're likely to disseminate a bunch of bad ideas that are just incredibly bad. First thing we explain is that this is perpetuated through things like the normalization. It is normal to do the sorts of individual tasks that we explain the drill instructors want to do because they want to test each individual individually, but it is also because they want to see what lengths you're willing to go for the army, what lengths you will sacrifice and what things you will do, which is exactly why this is the form of things they are likely to be able to do for one another, noting that it's often the drill instructors that pit recruits against one another, which just means it's likely that there are a bunch of recruits who either know or internalize that they can go it alone, or that those things are not just socially acceptable, but socially encouraged, or at the very least, it just means a bunch of people are really fucked up. And when those are your soldiers, that means that people behave irrationally, means that people die in a really, really bad way. Next thing I'm going to explain is why these people get promoted, or people with high scores on leaderboard get promoted in a way that means worse oppressor classes. First thing is that you just have very, very bad metrics for leaders, because you establish a culture of this, especially in the form of progression, is likely that in the same way you have require a certain degree of success early on in training, that leaders and people that are incredibly ambitious are the ones that are incredibly ambitious in terms of their leaderboards as well, which is why the people that succeed are the ones who are incredibly detrimental, the ones that are incredibly bad. Those are the people with a huge amount of say to do things incredibly badly. For those reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Thanks so much. Hello.
Okay, I would prefer verbal POIs because I'm in a different tab. So fundamental issue with OG's argument is that it's based on this idea that one, technology is so limited that we can only have leaderboards in this situation, and two, they don't actually provide you a model by which you can understand what's going on. So we're going to answer fundamental gaps that they failed to. Number one, what is the purpose of military training in the first place? Countries want to effectively determine which soldiers are most effective in a variety of scenarios, because oftentimes militaries aren't just people on the battlefield, but also people who are involved in like the creation of like military software and things of that nature, and which ones are most likely to provide value add to their military. Secondly, what is the problem with current military training under status quo? Traditional methods of training and mass recruiting have created a problem of cost and time, of time efficiencies, which taxpayers oftentimes are the ones who face the brunt of this. Now, what does this actually look like? This is our model. Given that access to militaries have the various technologies, it would likely be a direct human-computer interface and simulation-based games of sort. For example, VR simulations to emulate the experience of actually fighting, point system slash in-system rewards for doing things like saving a civilian, precise aim, etc., or leaderboards for different skills slash missions to identify who does well in what situations, or like analytics, which provide feedback for soldiers on how to optimize performance to save lives. Now, why is it that this is more likely going to be used for non-harmful issues? Because as OG admits themselves, it's really unlikely that militaries are somehow going to en masse get rid of things like drill sergeants, intensive physical requirements, things of that nature, that they have themselves admitted is what cultivates these toxic relationships. As in just a basic incentive analysis, militaries, like all institutions, use technology to fill in gaps, right, that they have within their system. If they admit that there are already drill sergeants on both sides of this house promoting this toxic work culture, it's more likely that this technology is going to be used as an incentive to create spaces for higher order thinking. This is things like ethics. This is things like rational decision making. Now, what are the unique benefits by which we're able to give you? Number one, you're going to lower the barrier of entry in order to decide whether the military is an appropriate choice for you. Oftentimes, it's the same problem that OG identified, right? Oftentimes, people like right out of high school will make the decision to go into the military at the point at which you don't actually understand what war looks like, you don't know what it sounds like, you don't know even how to conceptualize things, especially as OG admits, because of the fact that this would be more likely to be used in Western countries. A lot of Western privileged white middle-class people oftentimes don't understand war. And so by using this gamification, you're actually able to use this as like a pre-screening almost to decide whether this is something that's appropriate for you. But also it's going to be more appropriate physically. So it allows more consistent streams of collaboration and growth, actually. So for example, if you are training very intensively, and then you have a period at which you're doing these sorts of games, you're actually able to incentivize people to, one, rest because it's a little less physically intensive, but two, by extension, that's going to allow people to collaborate, right? OG seems to assume that these games are all going to just like be kill counts. But one, I'm a little unsure as to why they can't just spawn into the game together. But two, these games are going to be multi-purpose, which also brings into our another point. It's going to be far more cost-effective because gamification can reduce costs that are often associated with things like materials, trainers, and facilities, which require both specialist skill sets and linguistic abilities to communicate with a diverse group of people. So for example, if you want to reach out to communities that predominantly don't speak English as a first language, those are things that can be automated through emerging technologies. Fourthly, you have improved data analytics. It becomes much easier to discern which groups of people are more fit for particular roles in the military using objective gamified approaches rather than tangible, oftentimes biased or discriminatory practices, right? As OG recognizes as an issue in itself. Likewise, you're able to build intuition and reward systems in make or break situations. There are serious situations like things like civilian casualties or the increasing global drama around like the laws of armed command, for example, that military officials have to face complex and uniquely difficult challenges all the time, which makes it difficult to build an intuitive sense of what the right thing to do in that moment is. Now, we've already given you the incentive analysis as to why this would most likely be used for things like higher order thinking. So under status quo, you train people on first principles, but that isn't going to be guaranteed on the battlefield. Simulations provide a unique benefit because you can create reward incentives that prioritize, for example, protecting civilians. It also becomes easier to weed out people who are not fit to be military personnel as you're able to simulate realistic, ethical, and moral challenges, especially as new challenges emerge, like nuclear warfare, things of that nature. Also, a good majority of people who are in the military across the world don't actually go into the battlefield, but still need to have some level of screening. So it actually makes far more sense if you're going to be working, for example, in the Marine Corps in a more of a software capacity. It makes far more sense to you to be trained in a software environment. And then you're able to avoid unnecessary harms. So what exactly is the weighing here? Militaries across the world are responding to both historical and emerging issues in national and international security. At the point at which you're able to reduce the burden by which these financial institutions are created, but also you're able to ensure that this is going to be used something positively, especially because militaries, especially within the West, are heavily regulated and heavily scrutinized institutions. And as a result of that, you're more likely to have these technologies that are going to be used for like, not necessarily altruistic, but like higher order purposes. I'll take the POI.
Yeah, so if you acknowledge that we're still going to need lots of physical training and that this is more of a value add or additional bit of technology, why is this going to save any resources? Why does that point make any sense?
You're going to save resources because of the fact that, one, I hope you were listening to my speech, one, a majority of people who work in the military oftentimes don't even work in a physical capacity. So it makes far more sense that if you're not going to be working and providing value in a physical capacity, not to be wasting resources on people who are working in a physical capacity. But secondly, the things like ethical training, people who you have to bring in people who are specialists in like moral and ethical reasoning. These sorts of things cost money, and they cost money to taxpayers directly. At the point at which you're creating multi-purpose software that can be reused sustainably for multiple circumstances across multiple countries. Like if the United States creates software, it can then show it to its political and military allies to use that similar software, right? So like at that point, at the point at which you're able to do that, you're able to actually save quite a lot of money. Now, I think the results here are pretty simple. We're able to tell you tangibly why it is that we've created a model for you as to why it is tangibly that like this technology would likely be used for good things, and why it is that militaries as institutions and the nature of institutions themselves are more likely to use this as a means of filling a gap within the current status quo rather than promoting these war crimes that they're referring to. And also, I think it's really important to understand the distinction between like military training and actual military combat, which OG spends a lot of time on. We've created a system that is more sustainable, more repurposed, and more cost-effective in the long term, which will help fund these programs on the longer term. And so for all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Great, thanks so much. TPM.
The simple reason why opening opposition cannot win this debate is because they tell you some things that might be benefits of the gamification of military training that do not sound at all exclusive to gamification of military training, whereas we present you with harms that only come from it, and much higher impact ones at that. Two parts to this speech then. Firstly, on what benefits they tried to claim from the gamification, and secondly, on the harms we present. The first thing that they tell you is that it's going to be cheaper. They tell you that this has an impact for taxpayers. I think the first thing to really answer here is why would this be cheaper when you have things like software integrated or whatever unclear, but also why the fact it would be cheaper would mean that government spend less. Like the US, when they find a way to make something cheaper in the military, just divert the rest of the budget that's cleared up to other things in the military. Unclear why this is a benefit at all. The final thing here is that this is just absurdly low impact compared to the rest of this debate. So moving on, the next thing they want to tell you is that this is going to be used for ethics and training. The first thing to ask is unclear why it would be used for that, especially given the rest of the military, the precedent, the incentives, etc. But note also that they have no reason why ethics training is better when it's taught through the gamification. I think there is a certain amount of capital that exists to teach trainers, military people in training ethics in either world, and it's just about who uses it better. They give you no reason why it'd be better using it in this way, but I will give you the reason that ethics will be taught better in real life, because it is real, because there's consequences, because the main thing that we want to teach people is that this is a real person that you're shooting, and games take away from that. The idea that this is about progress and improving yourself take away from everything that you could possibly want to teach soldiers in ethics. The rest of it is just to explain that obviously the desensitization that happened from the other types that are not ethics training to detract from any benefit they were able to claim in teaching soldiers better ethics. And so all of that completely falls out of the debate. But no, the next thing they tell us is that the link between the POI that we hear is what is the link between leaderboards and achievements happening and worse behavior? I think the first thing that we explain is that desensitization desensitization happens because games aren't real, they're detached from consequences, and so they're easy to get into. But notably, you're taught that this is what your job is, and you're taught that those feelings that are not real and that this is not something that matters, and that pulling the trigger is not a big deal. Those things that you're taught apply to reality, and you're told to learn that way. That sets your expectation of the military, and that's enormously harmful. But even aside from that, and when we're not talking about these video games like sort of training with guns, we're talking about the way that leaderboards and achievements make you feel like progressing yourself in a selfish way. It means that you're likely to see all of these things as moral, so you're less likely to do things like whistleblow. It means you're likely to be a worse soldier on the ground in the first place, and those are enormously harmful. But the final thing we tell you here is that because this is the pitch, and I'll explain this in a bit more depth, the pitch for the military is what military training looks like. Making it seem fun with guns that you shoot in video games attracts a very specific and bad person to the military. Why is that true? It's because who is excited by the idea of these things, right? It's probably people that have less empathy, that are more likely to commit war crimes, that you're now getting into the military. These are not the people we want to get. What do they tell you here? They tell you that it's actually about higher order roles, and the military is not just comprised of soldiers. We're going to use this for people that are in the office or whatever. Notably, we're talking about the gamification of these things. That is not something that is used for university graduates that are going to be engineers in the military or whatever. We are talking about soldiers primarily, but also it's really even if you believe that this is also where the debate takes place, it's unclear why I'll give you the other reason that leaderboards exist in IRL training. The gamification doesn't have to be digitized. The idea of having a leaderboard in a training camp is also something that exclusively happens for soldiers. But finally, they do not present you with a benefit for higher order roles training that comes from this. Notably, we present you with harms that exist for soldiers, and that is enough for us to win this debate by far. But then the next, but they try and flip this claim about which side gets better people in the military on us. They say that this means that people will know if the military is for them because they could trial these games in boot camp or whatever, and that means that they'll be able to see if the military is for them. Notably, it does not matter if this opposition is able to claim the benefit that people know if this is something that they'll enjoy or not, because the cost of that is for the people on the other side, the people that are not in the West applying for the military, but are being shot by those people. Because when you have people that enjoy this gamification, that enjoy the progress and seeing someone on the screen die and then transfer that to reality, those people suffer in real life. We do not care if we want, I'll take the POI.
So if it is to the extreme that this person enjoys killing in the first place, would they not join the military on either side of the house? Or?
Okay, so the first thing is they are more likely to join the military on our side, on your side of the house, because they've seen this pitch of the military rather than seeing other things that are probably less attractive to them, but also the set of mechanisms we give to you about why this makes people desensitized. So if you join the military and we're better, you now get worse. And also we explain to you that when you change the culture even marginally in the way that it is more violent now, that attracts people. So all of our impacts are able to compound, and it turns good people away in the future. No, this doesn't just mean you get more violent people on the front lines. It also means that you're less likely to have anyone that will step up and report whistleblowing and civilian deaths. And that is a harm as well. Note, they tell you that they try and say that this is a benefit. It determines which soldiers belong where. But I think that is the biggest harm on their side, because it means that the person with the highest kill count that enjoys this the most is the one put on the front lines, where they would continue to get the highest kill count, civilian or not. It means that you get these things. This is what we've seen in reality with Australian special forces troops in Afghanistan, killing civilians and bragging about it in the group. Things like cost and time efficiency just cannot weigh against this. Note the scale of the harm we present. We give you reasons why you get more war crimes and less whistleblowers, because you make soldiers worse and you attract worse people. Even if you don't believe these harms accrue often, they are enormous. And note what OO presents means they are locked out of the debate because they can't weigh against even one instance of a civilian being shot. They tell you that this might be cheaper and that these things can be used in other ways without a single reason why they would be better, why it would be better ethics training after gamification. We tell you that none of their benefits are exclusive to their side, but all of our harms are. And for that reason, very proud to propose.
Thanks so much, TLO.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Okay. It's a real shame that OG's case had absolutely no model. And then when Dilan spent like 20 seconds clearly spelling out exactly what this gamification is likely to look like, they completely ignored it and continued to rest the entirety of their case on a conception where all this gamification looks like is selfish kill counts and encouragement of death. I think their mistake is not acknowledging what this gamification actually looks like. So I'll repeat to you what it's likely to look like and why that's actually mechanistically the most likely case for it to arise. We tell you a few things. The first is that you're likely to get way more things like VR simulations that accurately represent what you're actually likely to do on a battlefield so that you can actually emulate this and have experience doing it before you're doing it for the first time in real life. It's things like adding point system and in simulation rewards for doing things that are considered to be encouraged within the military, things like prioritizing a civilian life, being precise in the way you shoot in times where you're risking whether or not you're shooting at a military base or civilian lives, things like where you're prioritizing different leaderboards for different kinds of missions and drills so you can identify who's better at what and who ought to improve on what. This is what it's likely to look like. Why is that likely to be the manifestation of gamification rather than what they say, which is just kill counts and encouraging death? The first is that the only mechanism they give us for why that's their conception is because the military tends to be very toxic and grueling in status quo. But we tell you that the reason why they're trying to constantly push you and break you and why you're having to endure such physically grueling and intense training is because there's no other way in status quo to weed out individuals in the military who are capable of performing at a high level in the battlefield. So your best solution is to hit people as hard as they possibly can so you can ensure that no matter what happens on the battlefield, they're well prepared for it. On our side of the house, you're giving them a realistic conception of what's actually likely to happen. You're putting them in niche situations, so it's not necessary to completely push individuals to their breaking point in order to ensure that they're prepared. You can literally do it more accurately through things like simulations and through leaderboards that reward specifically what you aim to see on the battlefield. The second reason why it's likely to be benignly implemented is because oversight in the military is relatively large. Politicians are extremely skeptical of what's happening in the military because if it gets out, they look incredibly bad. What this means is you're likely to have things like oversight boards as well as just natural incentives for whistleblowers to come out and give widespread public praise and approval for exposing things in the military that are happening that are very bad. This is something that OG themselves admit exists and have incentives to happen on our side of the house, at least to some extent. So we tell you at the point at which you incentivize a system where you're getting points for literally shooting civilians in the head, yeah, obviously that's going to come out and there's no way they're going to want to do that. The third is that contractors are likely to hold you accountable. That is to say, you're not likely to just develop this in-house, certainly not in the next 2 decades. You're going to outsource this to existing companies that have infrastructure and developing things like simulations. And these are specifically the kinds of companies who have an incentive to come out against the government at the point in which they're asking them to do something incredibly bad. Because if they're found out to be helping the government doing that, their entire career and any other sort of contracting is over at the point at which they're found to be helping the government incentivize systems where people are just dying en masse. The last is that individuals are just incredibly skeptical of the military. This pulls an incredible amount of funding out of public taxes, whereas the benefits are not obviously immediately clear because wars don't happen that often. It's more of a precautionary thing compared to something like social welfare. What this means is that people are likely to be incredibly pissed if they see that a lot of funding is going to something that's naturally against their own moral instincts and intuitions. This is why militaries tend to generally be fairly accountable unless they're in completely dictatorial regimes in which I think probably the sort of abuse is largely symmetrical. So this is a number of reasons why we think it's likely to be denially implemented. They give us absolutely none of them, Judge. I think you ought to err on the side of the side that actually gives you mechanisms for why it's likely to be implemented in a way that encourages things like saving civilian lives as opposed to just kill counts, which they've naively been insisting on. I'll take a POI before continuing with rebuttals. Yeah, go ahead.
We explained that desensitization, we explained that there is likely to be an enormous amount of desensitization. Do you think in a world in which the way you learn to interact with civilians is going to be something that people remember when their heart is racing, when they don't know whether someone is a terrorist or a person in civilian clothing? Are they likely to remember that?
Okay, great. Desensitization was like my next point. Okay, 3 reasons why you're not going to get desensitization and trivialization of what it's actually like to be in the military. The first is that this is not the only thing you're going to be doing, right? I think gamification is going to be contextualized by individuals to make sure you're understanding the weight of what's happening. Individuals are going to be telling you what's likely to be happening on the battlefield before this. You're still going to get like verbal simulation from individuals who are telling you what the stakes are. Like to some extent, yes, this is like mitigatory as opposed to completely taking out the argument, but like it's not like all you're going to be doing is playing fun and games. Like the military is pretty good at instilling a sense of urgency in their soldiers. They've been doing it forever. Secondly, I think the human brain is just incredibly easy to manipulate in a way based on things like reward system that you get from points, right? So even if it is the case that you're losing the value or the gravity of what it's like to be on a battlefield, insofar as through repeated training of what you're doing on the battlefield, you're gaining the sense of intuition for what you ought to do. Maybe the first time you shoot a civilian and you lose points, and then like that looks bad to you because you want points because your brain wants to feel like you're doing well. Over 20, 30, 100 simulations, no matter whether or not you actually feel like you're on a battlefield, if you train your brain intuitively to shoot in one direction as opposed to another, you're going to do it on the battlefield if you succeed that the simulation is plausibly realistic enough to what you're actually going to encounter. So whether or not you're actually going to get a perfect simulation, we think by having this done repetitively, you're way more likely to get individuals to have their incentives and sort of perception of the seriousness of the situation to align with what you're actually going to get in a battlefield than your side of the house where they're going in completely blind. Thirdly, we think that like when you're actually on a field, yes, to some extent, the fact that you've been doing it so many times in a completely removed setting and now you're actually on the field is going to give you this sort of adrenaline, going to give you some sense of gravity. It's not like you're going to be 100% bought into the idea that you're in a simulation. You're going to build that sort of intuition and instinct that you did through the simulations and through the gamification. But yeah, obviously you're still going to be able to understand this is something fundamentally different. I don't think people are going to be like, oh shoot, now I'm actually on the battlefield, my life is online, but this is exactly the same as all the simulations I did earlier. No, I think people are smart enough to sort of balance this along with the training that they receive through the gamification. I don't think they're going to trivialize it and have it be completely desensitized. Last thing I want to touch on is coercive marketing. I wouldn't push too much hard on this argument because they didn't spend very long on it, but I actually want to talk about it because we can flip this, right? We tell you that if it is the case that the military sincerely does become more engaging and enjoyable and less grueling for individuals, we think it's fair for the US government to now tell individuals that's going to be a fundamentally different experience for them, right? We think that if you're no longer having to push someone to the breaking point in order to make them feel the gravity or the realism of a situation of being in war, that's a good thing that people ought to know. We think if you have more flexibility, because now you don't constantly have to be in a military camp, you can go to a virtual center, for instance, and that gives you more flexibility in how you live your life. That's a good thing. If you're more likely to therefore apply yourself in a way that's effective because you're able to identify what kind of military deployment you're good at, that's a good thing. We think that in this case, you don't even need to lie anymore. In status quo, you have to lie because no one likes the military. In the world in which you can actually optimize this, make it better for individuals by putting through these simulations, it's a lot better and the incentive is less. In status quo, the incentive to lie to people to maximize recruitment exists already. All we're doing is making it so that this is less deceptive than it actually is because there's reasons for you to want to go to the military now than there wasn't in the first place, which also means that now in status quo, when you're disproportionately recruiting from like poor individuals who are now whisked away from their families and their jobs to serve in the military because they don't have any more option, you're more likely to get a diversification of this pool in the first place. We actually tell you what the model is and why it's likely to happen. Very proud to oppose.
Great, thanks so much, Emo.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me just get my timer up. Yeah, please POIs in the chat. I'll try take one around 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1.
go. The most important thing in this debate is having skills on the ground, because that's what's the difference between life and death. Is the difference between shooting a child or a terrorist. It's the difference between being able to survive a situation where your gun is jammed or where your technology is faulty, and being able to fix that technology, being able to treat a patient under extremely high pressure and not being able to treat that patient. This is where the debate matters, because this is where very real lives, both civilians and soldiers and combatants, are lost, and where we can save people. And I think this is like the main impact that should be thought about in this debate. So what do these games look like? I'm going to first characterize much more concretely what a charitable view of these games should look like. Then I'm going to give you incentive analysis for why this charitable view of the game looks the way it will do. And then I'm going to explain why we just get all the benefits, and explain why OG and CG's cases just can't interact with this, because they're just reliant on a very uncharitable and faulty premise of what these games look like. So firstly then, what do these games look like? I think they look like several things. I think firstly, they just look like things like combat scenarios, such as in VR, where you're taught to do things like shoot the terrorist or shoot the person who's a big threat, whilst punished for shooting a civilian or shooting someone else who shouldn't be shot, or someone who isn't a threat, right? So I think that's the sort of combat scenario. I think many games, even like that you can play on an Xbox, already do this as like in hostage games where you meant to like shoot the guy who's holding the person hostage, but don't shoot the hostage. Like, it's not that complicated of a concept that it can exist, that you punish bad behavior. But secondly, right, that games you can get software to do things that are perfectly inert, that don't involve killing people, like loading a gun, like rewarding the speed and accuracy of loading that gun, or fixing technology, or saving a patient, a virtual patient. All of these things can earn points on the leaderboard. All of these things are software games that already exist on the status quo. I don't see why the military cannot apply. So this is much more concrete analysis than OG and OO gives, and CG tries to abuse this sort of vagueness, right? We've proved it's possible for these games to be good. We're going to give you now incentives, proper incentives, for why these games will look like this and why these games will result in good things. Okay. So why would the military do this one? This is the bulk of our case in terms of incentive analysis. I think a lot of CG is very uncomparative because they don't explain why individual soldiers do good things. And a lot of OG as well is predicated on a massive amount of incompetence from governments, right? Misadvertising to individuals, right? Sort of incentivizing individualism and a lack of teamwork, human rights abuses to the point of promoting such bad behaviors to commit war crimes. I think we're going to deal with this. OO is vague, right? OO does try to do this because they say that militaries like naturally fill in holes in its training, and then they give some vague accountability mechanisms. The government holds the military accountable, contractors hold the military accountable, the public holds them accountable. But so you might buy from them that yes, the military might not design this to perpetrate war crimes, but OO is unable to have any positive case, because none of the incentive analysis they give you actually explains why why this accountability that they talk about is actually going to mean this technology is going to give you positive benefits of less war crimes, of better trained soldiers. They don't explain any of this. So yes, you might get less war crimes from OO's characterization, but it's not clear why this is going to be competently created in a way that's actually going to be useful for people. So for them to unlock a positive case, to actually take a first in this debate, they need to have run this, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, so several specific reasons. I think firstly, the military has access to trained experts, such as officers and computer experts and psychologists, in order to design these games. I think the military is extremely well connected and has a lot of expertise. It also has the budget in order to hire these experts to take part in these things. But I think secondly, and this is extremely important, we need to characterize who makes these decisions in the military. Who is going to be designing and consulting on these training simulations that are going to be used in the military? I think it's going to be people who are former soldiers. Why? Because the former soldiers are people who are looked up to in the military. These former soldiers have actually been in combat, but even more importantly, former soldiers are the ones that the government and civilian governments trust to make important strategic military decisions. That is why the vast majority of US officers and US generals have seen active conflict, whether it be in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. And so I think these are the individuals who make it. Why are they going to make this well, and why are they going to tell the computer experts and the psychologists to design this in a good way? I think for several reasons. I think firstly, they've just had a real experience of war, which means that they know the importance of teamwork. These individuals have literally died, have been injured, have been crippled trying to save their squads. They know how important teamwork is. And so this is likely to be something that's going to be incentivized. This looks like rewarding cohesive squads in a game simulation for working together to take down a terrorist cell, right? So I think they're going to be really encouraging of teamwork because that's something that they care about a lot and they have seen successfully applied on the battlefield. But I think secondly, and it's not, governments have a huge incentive for this, but it's not just a generic mechanism about oversight wars. It is the fact that the point at which militaries commit war crimes and they're encouraged to commit war crimes, this has huge issues and huge detriments to the national prerogatives of civilian government. That is that the moment you commit war crimes, as we've learned in Afghanistan, no thank you, as we learned in Iraq, all of these things, like these governments have learned that like they've created a huge amount of alienation and hatred from local populations that have severely hindered and made it really difficult to fight terrorism because the local population just hates you. And so the government has huge incentives to ensure that these things do not perpetrate war crimes. This is also why it's unlikely for government to use these to try and like prioritize the military, encouraging violent people to join, simply because it makes the operations that they do abroad so much more expensive and so much more harmful to the image of the government doing these things, which is why they won't do it. But even more importantly, right, the old guard and the old military people are going to be more likely to focus on things like practical skills because those are skills that they found most useful on the battlefield. They're going to prioritize you learning how to deal with a jammed gun. They're also able to create realistic scenarios where you have to weigh up ethics because that's what they've had to do. And fourthly, they've often experienced a huge amount of bad things on the battlefield. They've had to see so many horrors. They are scarred and have so much a huge amount of trauma with that, right? Which means that they often want people to know about the horrors of war and to try and prevent those atrocities occurring in the first place, which is why this is going to be designed very well. Why is this important? This allows us to unlock so many more positive impacts, right? Firstly, we're able to explain why you're able, from these well-designed games, you're able to develop important muscle memory and help beat back against like the fear that you might have, which often leads to like the trigger-happy war crimes that occur when people are scared that a civilian has a gun, even when they don't. You get confidence in your skills. All of these things are a result of having muscle memory, being able to repetitively be able to train up and play a game. And so you're able to get all those things, but even more you can pinpoint errors, but you're punished for making bad decisions. So you learn from your mistakes. For all these positive reasons for why this motion is a good thing, please vote CO.
Thanks so much. Ahmed.
I'm going to take 2 POIs from OG. Just 1 second. I'm going to begin this speech by dealing with CG, a team which I think is quite literally entirely actually derivative of opening government, because I think they use many synonyms for the word desensitization. Their case is about desensitization, but also just note that the last like 4 minutes of rebuttal that they gave to our case, because clearly they're worried about us, is in direct contradiction to their weighing against opening government, because their weighing against opening government is that opening government is uncharitable, therefore our case beats them. But then they go on to give reasons as to why militaries are going to have bad incentives that rely on military culture. I think that they are clearly just out on the basis of their arguments itself. But let's deal with what CG says in response to our case first. So what they explain, is that in these games, the main thing that you're going to get is the ability to be able to mercilessly kill other people. So I'm going to flip that argument in a second. But what they go on to say is that, so as a result of this, the thing that the game is going to prioritize is just killing a bunch of people, as opposed to, actually prioritizing the things that Ahmed talks about, which is why the game is going to be programmed by helping people practice, saving other people, getting out of dangerous situations, being pro-human rights, all of the stuff that we talked about. But the reasons that they give for this are uncomparative. They say, first of all, that the government wants more killers. So look, this is extremely simplistic because it ignores Ahmed's analysis. We explained that governments don't just want more killers, because when there are more killers, that makes it much harder to actually see an end to the conflict. Why? Because when you keep shooting and mowing down the local population, when you keep attacking civilians, when you do more and more human rights violations, that is the thing that empirically has turned local populations against the military. That has made it much harder to have tactical operations. That has made it much harder to have post-military occupation transitions, which is why it is actually in the strategic interest to program these games by creating benchmarks that value teamwork, that value saving civilian lives. So there are probably in the algorithms that we talk about, things that are like, oh, you win an award for being, the most team player soldier, for like saving the most other people. You have saved the most civilians, therefore you are the person who wins. And the reason why this actually flips this argument is because on both sides of the house, look, like a person is going to prioritize their life if they think they're in a life and death situation. But on our side of the house, they get two things. Firstly, they get infinite practice situations and infinite practice times. They get to practice escaping from a ton of situations. They get to get used to it. They get to get desensitized to seeing it. And as a result of that increased confidence, they have more ability to do this in a good way. But secondly, we also see more ability and knowledge about how to actually do this thing because they are put into different situations. Therefore, the fact that the government wants more killers doesn't work as a response. Sure. OG, go ahead.
Your case is premised on the idea that governments have good incentives, but doesn't it obviously face two problems? One, where were these incentives in Iraq and in Afghanistan?
No. So great. Thank you for that POI. I'm about to take you again if you want to make the second response then. Yes, of course they were present in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is the point of our case. We have learned from the failed military excursions of the past to not just tell soldiers to kill people willy-nilly. The second thing that they say is that your civilians and your government obviously want to protect civilians. Of course, this occurs symmetrically on both sides of the house as well. This is why without any training, without any leadership, without any motivation, and all the teams agree that this motivation does make soldiers do better things, those soldiers are still going to do those bad things. They're still going to prioritize themselves. The difference is we program into the system good goals, good things, because that is what these people want their soldiers to do. Therefore, none of their responses work. Finally, let's go to their argument where they talk about, desensitizing people and more people being killed mercilessly. This is also going to deal with opening government's claim on the same issue. I'm going to flip it in two ways. The first thing to say is, yes, it is true that, you don't actually get to be in these high panic situations. But I think the difference is that there is still a difference between when you're in a real life panic situation and when you're in it during virtual reality, because you're doing it in virtual reality on their side of the house. But in a real world situation, you're shit scared, except now you've done that situation like 100 times before in like Iraq, in the Amazon, and like a bunch of different simulated environments, which means that you are far more prepared to actually handle that situation when it occurs, because you now know how to save your fellow soldier who's in a tough situation. You have better ability to unjam a gun in a dangerous situation. You have better ability to administer medical care. So that means that in both sides of the house, these soldiers are in dangerous situations and they are scared of them, whether or not it is virtual reality or not. There's no justification for them why they become completely desensitized. However, in the most dangerous situations, people are less likely to freeze up. Therefore, there are fewer deaths, there are fewer casualties, and that's a huge reason to vote for us. But finally, I just don't think that they ever give you mechanisms to explain why soldiers are in fact better decision makers than the people who program these things. Like they just say that we prefer humans to be making these decisions. Why? In fact, you have to believe for their case to work that humans are incompetent and bad at making decisions. If you believe any of opening government's material, you have to believe that they are bad at making decisions. The difference is that now they operate under goals that are far better than they would have otherwise been. Therefore, we flip this point. OG again.
Yeah, surely a more violent military that is also more efficient just means more murder. And
no. So it's not violent and more efficient, right? So this is where, I get your POI. So it's not violent and more efficient. So let's deal with that OG thing here. So their argument is that armies are toxic and gamification is going to reward killers. Look, the first thing they say is that people are going to compete over how many people they kill. But note that this kind of competition exists on both sides of the house because of the structure of militaries. The fact that it is a ton of men who have spent years training, thinking about taking down the enemy. The fact there is oftentimes a ton of testosterone because of the toxic environment they discussed. The difference is it's better when that competition is formally organized and measured by the officials of the military because they have much better incentives than the soldiers themselves. One, because military leaders are far more accountable to their previous experiences and because they have entire fleets who have done this before. So they are not idiots. They know it is harmful for their troops to be killing civilians civilians willy-nilly. They are strategists to know that this turns wars against fleets, generate anti-country sentiment, for instance, and generate support for terror uprisings. Therefore, they have an incentive to make awards for positive actions, like being a team player, like the civilian awards. This explains why the military will actually reward good things as opposed to bad things. The competition shifts because the people who are more responsible and informed get to set its rules rather than the people who are the most toxic itself. Secondly, they say we're going to get a focus on individual performance, and that is going to make people compete and kill people. I think the problem here is that the link between focusing on individual performance and human rights abuses is very, very tenuous to me. I think if someone is willing to do a human rights abuse, they're going to do it whether or not they get a little award for doing so. Like, look, when you're on the field, the main thing you're thinking about yourself. If you are willing to risk your life to commit a human rights violation and you are morally bankrupt enough to do so, you will do so whether or not the game exists. But we flip this because we explain why the game is pro-human rights. And finally, they say, oh, desensitization will lead to detachment. But I think virtual reality doesn't desensitize you because in real life, you still have to face the situation and it's still bad. Finally, I think all of this material is far better than OO because it explains why the incentives of this game are actually good. It explains with far more, I think, like less vulnerability, why the training actually improves, why it can be scaled without relying on things like funding, without relying on like large institutional incentives. We just explain why these benchmarks will be good. And that is why you should vote for CO. Thank you.
Great. Thanks all for a fun round. Cross the floor, shake hands. You can leave the breakout room. We'll call you in about 15 minutes, hopefully.